again. So I had this mint tea in here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but I filled it up with this hot mint tea, but it looked like a specimen. I thought I would just put butter in it because it just looked like.
Well, especially, yes. Good point.
I mean, we're all so easily distracted.
Board members, if we could all take our seats.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak Kofax. It is 1 o'clock, and so we are ready to start this meeting.
Get Mr. All right, board members, we are ready to begin our first work session of the new year and with the newly convened board. So welcome to everyone for your first work session. And just a few ground rules before we get started. And the process used in this is we will have a brief presentation from staff, and Ms. Omesh and I are leading this session, and we will take your names. You can look at me to take your names. Ms. Omesh is going to help with the timing. You will have 3 minutes. You can choose to do it one of two ways. You can choose to get all of your questions out, and then the staff will respond. Or if you have a few questions, you can do them one at a time and ask staff to respond in between. And we will stop the clock when staff responds. But you have 3 minutes to speak and to ask questions. This is the agenda item number 1, the capital improvement plan program. And we are looking at it for 2021. All questions are welcome for work sessions. This is where we do the deep dive, but the main objective for this particular session is to ask questions because we will need approval for the cash flow, and we will be taking action on our capital improvement plan on January 23rd, right? Is it February? I thought it was January 23rd action. Maybe that's... Ms. Malberg, I thought I had January 23rd on here. Look, go to the calendar so we have a, action is February 6th with, okay. Action February 6th. So with that, Mr. Plattenberg, if you will introduce Ms. Ellis to all of us, so the public knows, and any other members of your team that may be answering questions on your behalf.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for this meeting. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you this afternoon. Ms. Jessica Gillis is our Special Projects Administrator. She oversees both the planning and the design and construction folks and does an excellent job with an extremely talented force of staff, of employees that have prepared a lot of information. And just as a recap for the members of the public that may not be aware, the CIP document is a planning and fiscal management tool that we use for the coordination, location, timing, and funding of projects over a 5-year period. It includes the proposed capital improvement projects, a year-by-year schedule of anticipated spending, and actual and estimated cost estimates. The CIP is a working document, and it's updated annually, reflecting the changes and conditions within our schools and our communities. Additionally, it offers a broad planning schedule in order to focus staff efforts and community conversations. FCPS does face some significant capacity challenge that requires strategic decisions about boundaries, capacity enhancements, new schools, and programmatic changes. Our goals are to provide, number 1, adequate and appropriate educational facilities to accommodate the instructional programs for all Fairfax County students. And number 2, to provide appropriate support for facilities that will permit the school system to operate efficiently and cost effectively. From the county, the CIP is looked at as more of a planning document. It's subject to change each year as the needs of the community become more defined and projects move closer to final implementation. Our adoption of the CIP and then their adoption of the CIP in its totality for the entire county is neither a commitment to a particular project nor a limitation to a particular cost. But as such, it's a basic tool for scheduling anticipated capital projects and capital financing. The CIP, as in any CIP, is a key element in planning and controlling future debt service requirements. For this reason, the CIP includes some projects where needs have been defined, but specific solutions or funding amounts may have not been defined. And I read that to you for those that members of the community that may not be familiar with our process. It is a specific process, as was mentioned by Ms. Derenak Kofax. You know, we are looking, as our part of the conversation in this work session, is really looking at the individual projects that we've identified, the timing of those projects, the funding of those projects, and so on. However, our annual review of a capital improvement program, which is a 5-year look, really covers soup to nuts everything facility-wise that we can see. And our document has grown to be both dynamic and also static, with some static elements to it that have been in there for some time, such as board policies and things like that, and also dynamics such as projects and cash flow and the like. So with that, I'm going to just do a brief recap of the board meeting, school board meeting held December 19th, and Ms. Gillis presented on the capital improvement program. I'm not going to go through this ad nauseum as it was presented, but it is posted on our board docs for those that want to have a refresher as what was discussed in that meeting. I think it was rather late. I think it was about 11:30-ish or so when that was covered. The capital improvement program, as I mentioned, really is just an annual update to the CIP. The facilities data to identify future capacity needs and so on. Based upon these needs, our CIP program summary includes anticipated schedule of these projects and the capital cash flow. That capital cash flow provides a summary of the allocations of funds for the identified projects. When we take a look at student membership, we've talked about this in the past. Our membership of 188,018 students from school year 18 to 19, the 189,010 to school year 19-20. We have increased by 992 students, and the breakdown is provided on this chart. We are seeing some kind of shifts in some of those data and how they're reflected. The birth to kindergarten ratio, it's important to note, remained the same as last year at 87%. But the total number of births and birth rates have been on the decline since 2008. Transfers, we identify that information, are students who reside within one school boundary, referred to as their base school, but attend a school in a different boundary, which is referred to as their attending school. The total number of students who transfer into different schools amounts to 19,385 students, which is really 10% of our total membership, the size of some pretty good sized school divisions or school districts within the Commonwealth. 26% of our transfers are for AAP, Advanced Academic Program, 21% for Special Education, and 18% for reasons in the Student Transfer Regulation 2230. Student membership continue when we talk about migration. The net migration is those that are coming in for in-migration and really they are leaving, which is the out-migration for the division. We've had some shifts in this in the past. The net migration for school year 2018-19 was we lost 357 students, and then in 19-20 we gained 1,725 students. When we talk about student membership projections, overall we've been showing what we've termed as a contracted growth. We used to, at some time ago, had about 3,000 students a year approximately that our growth was. And so now we're still growing, but we say at a contracted level. A lot of our growth is shown in the middle to high school years. And as I said, when I mentioned the demographic data that reflect the birth to kindergarten ratio and the fact that we're having less births, that kind of an indicator that we monitor annually. And that is another reason why we look at this 5-year projection on an annualized basis. Our funding sources for the CIP, they include the general obligation bonds of $180 million annually. The county has been very good with working with us, both boards, the school board and the board of supervisors, working together to identify increasing sources of funds And we continue that dialogue and that conversation. I know the superintendent has continued that. The school board has expressed an interest for that continuance. And we continue to see how we can gain additional funding for our general obligation bonds for our capital project program. The reason why we are looking at that, because our needs are around 290 million, if you will, 270 to 290 million annually, gaining 180 million. That's the reason why we have a 37-year average renovation cycle when the school board policy recommends a 20 to 25-year replacement cycle. They have been giving us more money. They increased our bond issuance went up from 155 million to 25 million, and in that conversation, we also identified a way to defray the cost of the 13.1 million that were operating costs of basically expenditures for major maintenance items out of the bond funding. So in essence, it was an increase of spend of $38 million towards renovation or additions. And we applaud that work, and I know, as I said, Dr. Brabrand and the leadership at the county have been looking at ways to continue that endeavor. Major maintenance projects is a summary of what the top 5 2019 expenditures were placed on. Of that 13 million we get, playground equipment repairs and installation. Some of that's to meet ADA requirement, asbestos removal, concrete repairs, boiler repairs, and floor tile installation. It's important to note that floor tile installation really doesn't include carpet replacement, so there are other things that aren't included in that, but I want to go ahead and provide you with an overarching look at that. Infrastructure management, as I mentioned, of that 13.1, the roofing replacement, HVAC replacement. There is an IT infrastructure component, an ADA accommodation component, and athletic replacement, asphalt replacement, and safety security components that are included in that 13.1. We do provide, as a follow-on question that's usually requested about that, what are we spending those on specifically, and we have provided those in budget questions annually. So the capital project summary, we have funded the Northwest County Elementary School, which is at the McNair Elementary School site. We do have the Fairfax Oakton Area School site to be determined. We're partially funded for the Silverline Area Elementary School planning. We have capacity enhancements. We have modular relocations that are 2 to be determined: Justice High School addition, Madison High School addition, West Potomac High School addition, and projects beyond the 5-year horizon. It's important to note we keep talking about this future Western High School, and we do have projected needs for 5 new and/or repurposed sites, including Dunlowing Pimmet Hills, Route 1 Elementary School, Tyson's Elementary School, and Virginia Hills. The cash flow in and of itself, when you look at the numbers themselves, the total 5-year requirement over $1,072,619,378. Out of that, we have funded approximately $500 million. Unfunded is the remaining balance of $573,178,623. The 10-year requirement is pretty daunting, of $2.1 billion. Of that, funded is about $500,000, and the remaining is unfunded. It's important to note, when we look at these things, and you look at $180 million every 2 years, that currently is the funding, you'll note that in our CIP, within the 5-year continuum, we do recommend an additional increase to our bond capacity to basically address the issues that I just pointed out about the unfunded. The math does work out if you keep looking over the 5 years and you look at that increase in the request of our funding to cover those dollar amounts, but it is pretty daunting. Capital projects that are currently funded by bonds that have been approved include the list that I have up here: 6 elementary schools under construction, 12 in planning, 2 middle schools under construction, 2 in planning, 2 high school renovations under construction, 4 high schools in planning, which include 1 high school renovation and 3 high school additions. Recent completed renovations include Holland Meadows Elementary School, Waynewood Elementary School, West Springfield High School, White Oaks Elementary School as well. In the CIP document, we're really pleased to have expanded it. It's gotten more dynamic. We've included new content. This version of our CIP maps and tables reflecting the capacity utilization of schools with and without modulars, and these can be found in the membership and capacity comparisons tables. The resources include tables with elementary and middle school AP center assignments. Schools listing in the appendix have been expanded to include additional information on temporary classrooms, modular, and feeder schools. Similar to the schools listing, information for administrative and support sites or centers is new to this year's CIP. In addition, this year's CIP includes and contains a 10-year accuracy of the past projections of each school. You also find boundary adjustments that have occurred in the past. It shows the difference between projected and actual membership from past CIPs, and the 10-year history of the capacity membership and utilization for each school has also been added. Upcoming dates, in my conclusion, you'll see that we have new business was presented on Thursday, December 19th. The public hearing that we originally scheduled for the 27th is having to be rescheduled due to the snow day. It was scheduled for the 7th, rather, is rescheduled for the 27th. Our work session today on the 13th. We do have a tentative additional work session date on January 21st, and then the action that was mentioned by Ms. Derenak Kofax for February 6th. So with that, I'm open to any conversations or questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Dr. Brabrand would like to speak first.
I want to thank Mr. Plattenberg and Ms. Gillis for a wonderful presentation. We've been working really hard, and I want to just share with this board a couple of nuggets. Nuggets are things that I just think jump out. There's always so much information that the board and that the community absorbs around these things. A few things. One is we have had real collaboration with the county around the capital improvement process, the budget, working together and trying to have a one Fairfax look at all of our facilities. First, let me just speak about the budget. We did get, after I returned, I think our first year working together, and the boards had really set the groundwork to saying we needed more money for the renovation queue than just $155 million, which is what it was for years. Not a year, not 5 years. Huh? The bond, yes, the bond. That 155 was the case for years and years and years. We added $25 million. So that lets us speed up that renovation queue of 37 years to get to the national target of 25. We know we still have additional needs, and we're working very, very closely. Marty Smith, who wasn't able to be here today, he caught a worse cold than I had right as we were leaving, and I sent him home this morning even though we were meeting to discuss this. We are currently continuing ongoing conversations with the county about how can we look at the CIP in a new way. One of the things we've done too with that collaboration, as you may know about the solar project and the power purchase agreement, we went jointly with a One Fairfax approach, and now we're going to have solar power on over 100 buildings throughout Fairfax County schools and the county, not just 3 buildings, which is what was initially on the table. So that work is real. And finally, I just want to say to the staff, pull a CIP from just, let's just say 4 or 5 years ago, and look at the CIP now. The amount of additional detail that facilities and planning has provided, including this year, these historical projections have never been presented before. And a real question is, how good is the work that we've been doing? How accurate has it been? So we have tried to provide greater transparency to the community and to this board to help make these important capital improvement decisions. So I just want to say thank you, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I'll start with Ms. Tolan.
I appreciate all of those comments and echo how impressed I am with the document. But just to follow on what Dr. Brabrand was talking about regarding our increased collaboration with the county, I think what a lot of people are really interested in is the capacity data and information, and moving forward, how do we ensure that we have the best and accurate information possible. And I noted, just reading through the CIP a couple of times, there are 5, 6 different times, I can tell you the page numbers, where we talk about that additional collaboration and what's happening. But I think we want to be even more open about that. And one of the things that is also mentioned in there is a joint committee on infrastructure planning, which was held approximately 2014. That's quite a few years ago. And one of the things I might suggest is reinstating that committee, maybe so those conversations are made a little bit more formally. And, it was a one-time, short-lived task force, which I think we could probably do something like that again. I know we've called on our colleague, Laura Jane Cohen, to kind of be on FPAC and the Planning Commission and, the comprehensive planning to make sure we have continuity across all of those, which I think is excellent. That will help this board as well. I also want to make sure that our staff is fully supported in these efforts. I know it's a very time-consuming and a lot of work, and we are talking about, as Jeff pointed out, $2 billion, billions and billions of dollars. So I might suggest, and this will bleed over into our budget conversation, some additional staffing for that office to work with these task forces and really make sure that all of this capacity information and data is accurate and we can bring it to bear looking at some of the problem schools that we have.
All right, thank you. Ms. Cohen, followed by Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
I'd like to say the same thing. I know we have had the opportunity to meet already a couple times about the CIP, and I would just say to anyone in the community, if you want to kind of get at the root of some of the things that we feel as a community, I would say spend a considerable amount of time with the CIP because it is incredibly illuminating when you look at either program issues that we have, the tight squeeze certainly that our kids are feeling in the classrooms and in buildings. And, absent, I think for most of this board, a lot of the historical data about how things got to where they are, which I think is important. I still think going forward that there are a lot of things that we need to really look closely at. And some of the things that I found most illuminating is when you look at things like our academy programs page 183. There are huge gaps in our county where we are not allowing our kids to have that opportunity, where we're further complicating a transportation, problem that we have, where we're sending people all over and really overburdening our bus system, and I know we have a bus driver shortage, but trying to look at that when you see, well, this is why people are not having access to these programs. And I think when we talk about equity, for a lot of us, access is the really key word there. So I would just hope that people can take a look at that. I would say, the same things when you look at even some of our alternative sites and where they're located, kids having access to non-traditional programming. You look at some very central places, and then everybody in the outliers, again, becomes Mr. Plattenberg's job to get them there. And so, again, talking about overburdening. Also, AAP centers, I just would like to say that the AAP map is awesome. We have talked about the opportunity to get a more dynamic on the website where we could overlayer this with capacity. Do we have programs at schools where they are far over capacity and were a good opportunity for placement when we open the programs, but are now overburdening those schools? So, do we need to get creative about where kids go to be able to access some of those programs in terms of capacity? But I think we all feel a real passion to talk about capacity. Stella and I have had the opportunity for some shared schools to have some recommendations for page 40, which I imagine is something we'll talk about hopefully in a few minutes. But I am grateful for this document, and as I said, I think it's very illuminating about kind of what's going on here in our county. So thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
Just to echo, I also am really grateful for the amount of detail and information in here. It is very illuminating when you put it together. I had a couple of questions or thoughts to bring up. First, thank you for the amount of work you all have done and the level of information and for taking the time to sort of walk us through all of this. It was all very helpful. One of the questions I had is on page 8, it talks about the definition of capacity. And I look at capacity as two ways, is the number of students and the building space for programs and classes and what they have there. And on page 8, it talks about the elementary school being calculated based on the number of core classrooms and self-contained special education classrooms. My question is, does core classrooms include programs such as music and arts, or are we looking at building space capacity simply based on grades 1 through 6 and maybe PE and special education contained classrooms, because I've heard again from the community the concerns around art on a cart and things like that. And I only say that jumped out at me because it said in separate middle school, which are team taught, are assessed differently than those who follow the high school model. And the high school model goes on to read that it's based on core programs and various elective options. So I didn't know, really my question is, what is core in elementary school as opposed to what's written in high school in terms of building space?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Sajmoheiser. Yeah, that's a good question. When you look at the core requirements, generally speaking, it is just the general education. However, it is also what we have in our program specifications for the educational program. And what does that mean? When you look at some of the offerings that we might have at the elementary level, the music program, for example, was in there. But it doesn't include band, strings, choral. So when you start saying the core, it's looking at the base core of the instructional program. So, and what I can do is I can go ahead and follow up and send everybody a written response on that. That'll give a better depiction and also an example for your reference.
And I have one additional question as well. When I was looking at capacity in terms of, again, number of students, what I didn't seem to find in here, I apologize if I missed it, was capacity for some of our special education school centers, such as Quander and Burke School. And I know it must be harder because those aren't geographical capacity students, or students aren't assigned necessarily to those schools as part of where they live. But, one of the things that I'm interested in potentially doing is adding or looking at the possibility of advanced academic type classes within some of our centers. I didn't know if there's building capacity space for things like that.
So that's, again, another great point. I think what we can do is articulate that further as this document continues to evolve to make sure that's specifically stated as to how it's accommodated. We do take a look at the individual space required per child, and it's based upon the type of need. So we do accommodate for that, and graphically, if you look at some of the students with varying needs may have more requirements to meet their needs, and therefore more square footage. And we do have that broken out graphically, but it's not in this document. So that's an excellent point where we can make an enhancement on the document. We'll be glad to add that.
Thank you very much.
All right, I have Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Hi there. Thank you for this, this hard work. I just want to echo that I think that partnering with our Board of Supervisors is completely crucial, and I think more than ever we need to accept the mantle of positioning our schools as the greatest investment that our county makes. I mean, this is the bulk of the investment. So, I'd like to think about more how we can put into place, whether it's the renewing a task force or protocols or process, but something to really solidify that this is not a nice to have. It absolutely must be done in partnership. So I just want to comment to that. And then I was wondering if, when you talk about the space and the programs, I mean, clearly you've identified the programs and how that's used to calculate class size and such and capacity, but I'm also wondering about ideas for using space in a different way. So for instance, students have asked for a space to have a mindfulness practice or to go and pray. So how can we start thinking about use of space to find ways that we can honor that? And some schools do it not in a closed classroom, but in like open spaces. So just thinking about responding to that. And this segues into also net zero new construction, talking about, not only our solar efforts, which are amazing, and we've done a lot with Energy Star, but let's really up the ante here. And, our partners over in Arlington, every new school they build is a net zero school. So meaning net zero, for those who might not be aware, that they put out less energy than they're actually taking in, and it's actually a very teachable environment. So obviously we have to have the curriculum and instruction ready for that. But if you could speak to, what is, I'm also thinking about on school grounds, right? Learning outside, playing outside more, using our space. And I'm aware there might be some zoning issues around that. So for us as advocates, I'd like to know, what zoning issues stand in the way of doing more with the space that we have on our school grounds to get kids outside, either through play and learning. And also, what are you thinking about moving towards net zero as the new standard that we want to have when it comes to new construction and to the extent we can with renovation?
Well, thank you, Ms. Marin. Excellent points again. When you take a look at what we talk about with net zero, okay? My staff and I have been working towards that. I've been a really strong advocate for all sustainable initiatives, not only for the educational aspect, because our students expect, our communities expect it, and so forth. We have an incredible footprint on what we've been doing in our reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. When you take a look at 27% reduction over 8 years, when we've grown at 500,000 square feet per year, we are a leader. Now, that being said, we need to expand in our renewable footprint. We've talked with Arlington County and the funding that they get, the funding streams that they get, and the types of needs that they face. My brethren and sister over there share with me what it takes for them to be doing some of these things that they're doing, because I want to learn if I'm not doing the right things. I've tasked my staff to go ahead and design towards net zero ready. And a lot of that accomplishment is achieved through what Dr. Brabrand was saying that we are doing with the county, which is part of our solar array program. The challenge with some of our older facilities is trying to see how we can make them as efficient as possible. But to your point, it is a part of the learning program. It does tie into the instructional curriculum and so forth, and we do need a comprehensive approach to it. We are pushing in that area moving forward, and we do have a long way to go because we should have been doing renewables before we are now. But I do believe on being on the leading edge and not the bleeding edge. There are some experiences on some of the agreements and the commitments, but that's why we as a county are doing it together. I have taken a look and met with the folks that actually started their initial programs, and learned a lot from some of the learning curves that they had gone on. But the other question that you had, we do need to incorporate all of that. First of all, I'll just finish up with the renewables, and we do need to expand that. On the I'm going to be presenting on the 21st, January 21st, a renewable report, and we're going to talk about that pyramid that goes into the renewables, because that is the next phase of our progression. There was something else you mentioned about zoning. Oh, outdoor learning and so forth. We do provide in our Get to Green program, we have a lot of different schools that have some amazing things where they have natural gardens, outdoor gardens. Some have outdoor learning spaces. But to the point of both of these things, it really will be something that we would have to envelop into our educational specifications. Currently, it's rather organic, and it's been a one-off, if you will. So not only have we been pushing that to get the form, right, follows the function, and if we get the functional components codified in our educational specifications, then it becomes part of what's designed to. I mentioned the core program and the ancillary spaces. Well, what is in our educational specifications is what we design towards. We do accommodate those other things, but it's not a part of the codification. So what does that mean? What that means is, in our renewable report, we'll talk about where we're going on the area of our sustainable report about renewables. Then the second ever is we're going to be reporting back in the future about how we are designing our buildings to be net zero ready, and what would that mean. I've been told that there's costs associated with design, costs associated with the constructability. But I'm of the school of, well, if there is, then let me see the papers on that, and we'll all take a look at them and see whether or not there's any accuracy in that. And is it a total cost of ownership? Is the long-term benefit, not just the instructional piece, which outweighs some of these costs that you'll hear in the report I'm going to be giving on the 21st, but are there other elements that we need to take into account rather than looking at a snapshot, a broader view on it? So not only does it have to be included in the educational specification, but we do accommodate that. It is more organic right now, and we do have an opportunity to expand that space for both of those areas, renewables and outdoor learning and different learning classes on the exterior. Usually it requires a champion at the school. If that champion at the school right now with the Get to Green program, if that individual retires, moves on, moves up, whatever it may be, sometimes there's not somebody carrying the mantle. So if it is part of the educational specification, then it is, and it is part of the curriculum, then that does make it more systemic and sustainable.
Just to that point, I've actually been involved with research that shows that a lot of these programs, they are environmental ed programs, they rely on these superstar teachers or volunteers, and they're not sustainable, no pun intended. But so to me, it sounds more like a chicken and an egg thing. If if they want it, we'll build it. Well, what if we build it and then we have the curriculum and instruction aligned with it? So, I'd like to see us be more aggressive about this and not wait until someone is burnt out and has left and then there's nothing to do but watch it wither. No pun intended again.
All right, thank you. To my school board colleagues, we are keeping time for you, and I know sometimes it's hard to see from over there, but it's right there below Mr. Plattenberg's computer on the inside of this desk unit here, and there will be opportunities for go-backs as well. So we usually try to get through the entire board before we go to go-backs, but you can raise your hand and I can put you on the list. All right, and we have Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Mr. Frisk.
Great, thank you so much, and I'm so pleased to follow Melanie because I wanted to, and I'm glad, Jeff, that you mentioned the ed spec. So I'm going to ask that on the 21st, when you address the board about sustainability, if you could bring to that discussion what sustainable measures are outdoor gardens, things like that, that have been built into our ed specs, or whether or not we need, or how we can modify our ed specs to address just those issues. The second is I would love to support Ms. Marin if she were interested in it, of adding offering an amendment to the CIP that would set as an objective net zero schools for new builds. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to present it. I'll second it, or somebody else can second it. Actually, anybody else can second it, but that's the process that we use to influence the CIP. So I'm urging you, and if you need help drafting, I'll be happy to help you. But you have an amendment coming. Third, I do want to thank Mr. Plattenberg and your staff for adding the environmental sustainability section to the CIP. That is new and it's very helpful, and just appreciate it. And then the last piece is that when we look at this, one of the things that's not addressed in our CIP, but it impacts your budget and all of our budget, is if you go to the back and you see the long distances our students are on buses, what could we save as a system? What is the actual cost per mile of having kids on longer bus rides? So that's part of that discussion I think that we need to entertain with the Board of Supervisors is, invest now or we continue to pay. So I would like to have as a next step a better understanding of what the cost is per mile of transportation when we have kids on longer bus rides. And I would also welcome a further discussion on the 21st regarding the ed spec and how we can build in sustainability measures, what else we need to do in that, and the intersection between your facilities work and the instructional services work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Frisk, followed by Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you. Frisch is fine in terms of pronunciation, but no problem. Growing up, they either got my first name right or my last name right. They didn't get both ever. So, couple things. I can't wait for Melanie's motion. I'll just say that. I would like to ask that we think boldly. I look at the number of elementary schools that we will be building in the next decade, most notably the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School, which is the planning is funded, although I don't know how far along we are given that we don't have a location. Sounds like a perfect opportunity for our first net zero school. The other elementary schools are years away from construction or even the funding of planning. So I would very much like to plant a flag in the ground on the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School as a perfect option for building our first net zero school. And, I think we need to be conscious of where the world is on these subjects. When we think of Energy Star, we think monitors that take up our entire desk, right? and the conversation is moved to net zero. So I would like to hear from you, what has kept us from just jumping in and doing that, as opposed to making incremental progress on energy savings? Because there are complicating factors, obviously, with schools that are already constructed, but when you've got a blank canvas, what are the things that are standing in our way from doing that? And then I'll just jump through a couple more things and then I'll let you answer. On page 40, obviously, there's not a lot of detail there, and that's on us. I've spoken to many parents from Shrevwood Elementary School, which is bursting at the seams and only getting more bursty. And they're going from 118 to 120, I believe, % capacity. Many parents have told me that they were promised or that they were told that this year boundary conversations would begin for them, or that they should look forward to the new Dunloring Elementary School that might relieve capacity, which is 10 years away. So that needs to be put on the agenda for some clarification, and I plan on bringing that up in my 2x2, which is later this week, tomorrow, or day after tomorrow. And finally, obviously, finding a location for the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School that is not Blake Lane is a top priority for me, and I look forward to talking with you in more detail about that. I'd like to know how we go from 105% capacity for Mosby Woods to 87% capacity. I assume that includes the new elementary schools. And finally, Oakton is going from 130% capacity, and when the school is finished renovation, it'll be 122. I'd like to know if there's ever consideration put into stopping for a second mid-construction and thinking if we're building enough to actually handle what's going on. It doesn't seem like we're addressing any issues there other than making it look nicer. Sorry.
That's all right, I can put you on for a go back if you like. And
Okay.
Mr. Plattenberg, is there anything you're ready to address right now?
Yeah, absolutely. What's kept us from net zero is really cost per square foot. When you look at the cost per square foot of an actual physical plant that Arlington's been building and the cost per square foot that we've been investing in our buildings, the shortfall of the funding of our bond cap, our limitations, and our needs of capacity across the division, it's been problematic. Now, they're growing, there's no doubt. But when you look strictly put, that's how it's held us back in the past, even though we've been pushing at moving as fast as we can on sustainable initiatives. I agree. Furthering that conversation will definitely allow us to break it down, and that's why I say, show me, don't tell me, show me, so that we all can take a look at it, and we can all, with all of us working together, figure out a way forward on that, because it is way past time. In regards to Shrevwood, I'm glad you brought that up, Ms. Frisch, because that's an excellent point as well, in addition to the renewable one about net zero. When you look at page 46 of the last CIP, it was filled out, and page 40, as you mentioned, is blank. And that was by design, because that is the school board's work on what should be in there. The people from Shrevwood saying, hey, we were looking for a boundary adjustment, well, Shrevwood is in as a priority recommended boundary adjustment by region, by period, and it says potential timeline information. We did take a look at Shrevwood. We were in conversations about what to do about Shrevwood and continuing that conversation to include looking at Dunloring. But we also were looking at capacity and circulation around that building as well. So there were a number of factors, and coupled with the Blake Lane conversation and how that influenced the circumference of what we were looking at, and now widening that circumference and the potential of that, which may impact Shrevwood and so forth and some of these other schools, it really had us kind of pause and say, okay, well, let's look at this broader perspective because of the concerns that came up about the Fairfax Oakton. So definitely the 2x2s will be a perfect opportunity to delve further into those and ask detailed questions. The other one, do you want to address that, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. For Mosby Woods, you're asking about the 87% in the out year. So any of our future design capacity is yellow and italics, so we would have incorporated that, which we can go into more detail in the 2x2 to just kind of help with understanding how to use the CIP and how to read it. We have a million footnotes, and we recognize that it's a lot of information to keep in mind as you're reading through it, but that's where that 87% comes in.
And to your point, you had mentioned, and we apologize for not having your schedule before so we could have gone through this. It was a great idea. I know the snow day really kind of racked us up, but it was a great idea, brilliant actually, Dr. Brabrand and Chairman Corbett Sanders wanting to have those 2x2s so that we can get ramped up, because just like the budget, we're here. But the other thing you would mention is when we're building, can we stop and then immediately redesign? Some of these designs really start 6 years in advance of when prior to the construction. When we do the planning, and we start the planning of that, and we pay into that. That being said, we had made adjustments at Westfield, for example, when that high school was going to be opened. It is problematic because the permitting, the design usually is about 18 to 24 months, and then the permitting takes a year to a year and a half as well. So 2.5 years before, and sometimes 3, before we start construction, and construction of a high school renovation takes 4 summers, that timeline makes it challenging at best to then go ahead and make the changes. You will see, and we'll go further in the 2x2s, in the CIP, you will have recommendations of A through H. You are correct, sir. Oakton High School is a challenge. It's a positive challenge. It's growing at great guns. I mean, you've got a lot going on there. And even with the renovation and the addition that we expanded as part of that renovation, it is going to be a challenging situation when we're done. So great questions.
All right, I have Ms. Keys Gamarog, followed by Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mr. Plattenberg. Thank you for this thorough work. And I'm just going to kind of throw out some topics for future because I consider these discussions preliminary. When I consider my former background with the Planning Commission and the comprehensive plan and what's on for how we're going to be growing as a county, I see a lot of multifamily units. And I have continued to be concerned about how we calculate what students are coming from those units. There seems to be, or at least in previous discussions, that there's this assumption that in Fairfax County, we don't have kids in apartments. I would like to hear either now or at a later date how we have grown with our county, because I think the lack of affordable housing and accessibility to single-family housing may in fact impact what that calculation should be. And like many of my colleagues and Mr. Frisch just mentioned, I think as we look at that determination, we may find that that adjustment in our thinking and paradigm may be impacting how we're looking at our schools, and then, you know, oh, by the way, that's not working. So I wanted to make sure we looked at that. I wanted to, on page 33, we talked a little bit about, we look at some of the changes in our alternative schools programs. And I know that we did some extensive changes to the SR&R. And so I would like to look at how our buildings need to be changed as we are able to hopefully reduce the number of students. I know we've had fewer cases as a board as a result of those changes. I'd like to know how that may be impacting some of the need for those buildings and how that may actually change other things that we can do. I'd like an update specifically, not necessarily now, but it can happen in the 2x2, for example, for Glen Forest and Falls Church High School. And with respect to our boundary discussions, on page 62, I think there are 2 little islands identified. If I can get there before my time runs out. And you see the little orange pieces. I don't know if you can see it. There's olive blue for Langley, and then there's these 2 little parts. As part of that discussion we had, I know the community was wondering how many students we're talking about. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit more in terms of how many students we're talking about for those particular islands, and I can follow up with my next go back.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Keys-Gamora. And one of the things you mentioned was like along the lines of what Ms. Marin mentioned. When you talk about the spaces and the expansion of those spaces, some of the things that have been accommodated in the past, whether it be prayer or individual needs of a student, the spaces provided have been organic and have been part of how schools function. If there's a need for a student, the principal would generally identify a need that needs to be met, and we accommodate it. If it requires facility modification or any kind of space that's adjusted, then they contact us, and we usually work with them to help them identify such spaces. Some of the program changes you mentioned and how they've been organically addressed and how that's going to go into the future, I think that's part of the conversations that we're having. I know that Instructional Services has brought up some concepts where we talked about different school settings and different school meeting different needs and different types of buildings. We certainly have been aligned with that conversation, but we've got a lot further to go in that, and I think we will have an ongoing conversation about that. One of the things you mentioned is the change. Yes, that's where I'm headed with the multifamily. So, and that's why I got stuck up on my verbiage, is that we used to view it as new construction and new housing. Now our vantage on page 2, we mentioned this on the 3rd paragraph, we look at it as units. So that migration, we are keeping our eyes on. That resultant effect is something that we are very keenly looking at to see what the impacts will be. The early on units that were provided, and some of the ones in Tyson's, for example, did not yield what was anticipated, because as the development went forward, and you mentioned your planning commission background, the changes that were made, instead of being smaller multi-bedroom, they made them less bedrooms because of the pricing associated with it. So we're thinking that in that instance, maybe the initial affordability component and the initial occupancy rate, but we're still watching because we're starting to get a higher yield than we did when they were initially going up. So to your point, we are keeping an eye on that. I do know we are working with the county. They have a new system that was reported out when they were here that's going to help supposedly help us all work together to make sure that we can do better on that forecasting. Because although I mentioned the contracted growth, I'm not naive enough to have seen some of those shifts that have occurred in Fairfax County over the time when we've leveled off. And I think you're spot on when you mention the different type of housing types that we have. And I think we will see, it may be a period of time, but then we will see another shift where the yields are going to be greater and greater, because we've experienced that in the transition of multi-dwelling units in the past. So that's a good point.
All right, Dr. Anderson.
Good afternoon. You mentioned earlier that part of our work is to fill in page 40, so I'd like to kind of help you with that. I would like for consideration to be placed on the priority list on page 40, Glen Forest Elementary, with 12 trailers, 17 modular classrooms. It is still an elementary school of 1,100 students. And as somebody who was a principal of a school of over 1,000, it's not even just the space, it's just the support and the services you have to provide to an elementary school that large. And knowing the challenges of Glen Forest in terms of egress and ingress of buses, parking, teachers are regularly receiving tickets because they are parking in the streets. And so for me, this is an area of priority that I would like for us to take a look at along all these different sub-areas, but starting with the fact that we have 29 spaces outside of the building that's where some of our students are. And I know the modular classrooms are awesome, except for the ones with the columns in the middle of them. And when you have second graders trying to crank their necks over a 2.5-foot wide column, that does not make for the most instructional sound opportunities. So I would like to go ahead and add Glen Forest, if that's possible, if this is the time to do that. Is this the time to do that? To
Yes.
the priority list.
For discussion.
For discussion, okay. Do I pause now to have that discussion?
No.
I'm sorry? I am going to offer an amendment, I guess at another time, but I want to put that out there. The other piece that I wanted to offer for a conversation regarding the boundary feasibility, Falls Church High School, I guess I'm a little bit confused here too, so I would love your support in understanding this correctly. Page 102. The Falls Church renovation and addition is going to be completed when? Okay.
Well, the funding for construction is in the next bond referendum. So So we had the planning in the, not this most recent bond referendum, we had the planning in the 17 bond referendum, and then in 21, we have the funding for the construction. So the design will be ready when the funding, should the community approve that in November, we would be shovel-ready because we'll have the design complete, and it'll begin work probably around February. We'd start the construction, and then, as I said, 4 summers for a high school.
Okay. Okay, so I think that takes care of this question, but I would like to add that under the boundary feasibility, because we have a school that's going to be over capacity up until 24, 25, as per this list. How much time do I have? I also wanted to have conversation regarding Bryn Mawr and reduction of those trailers. There's 11 temporary classrooms there, so I would like to have that conversation. And I will save the rest of my comments for my go back.
Okay. Dr. Rayburn would like to speak.
Mr. Plattenberg, just as I'm thinking about this new board and the prior CIP, which you already referenced, had page 46, and this one we've left it blank because I assume because we have a new board, right? But we already were starting a boundary study around Glen Forest from the prior year's CIP. So I just wonder whether, maybe for purposes of helping the board, should we give them what was at least in last year's draft for that page, so they can either continue to say, I want to advocate as the prior board did? I'm just thinking those are things that I think could help this board not feel like they're starting completely from scratch.
Correct, Dr. Braven. We did provide page 46 as a reference, if you look in the documents there. And I do believe with Dr.
What page is that on then? The 46, the old 46 is in the new CIP?
Presentation.
Oh, it's handed out today. Okay, that's what I'm missing.
So, and I do understand from Dr. Anderson's comments that in looking at that, there are some changes about the whole scope and area of that to address concerns. So that would be, yes, there was, to make a modification to it is what I understand is the request.
Right.
And therefore, my suggestion or understanding of the process would be these work sessions provide concurrence.
Yep.
The potential inclusion of which, if there's concurrence by the body, to incorporate into their ultimately adopted CIP. How they want to do that through motion, certainly, or however is a governance issue.
But and we'll defer to the board, but if you would like Mr. Plattenberg to go through the old page 46 just to freshen up this board on what was in there as they decide what they want to have on page 40, that might be, and I see some heads nodding. If you're willing to do that, Jeff, you and Jessica, just to walk them through that old page 46 might help them tee up what else they would want to see on there.
I would love to. Now, this information that we talked about actually in our 2x2s, and I know we haven't been able to have all of them, but if you look at page 46 of the prior year CIP that we have, it goes through region, pyramid, school objective, potential scoping, potential boundary, and anticipated effective date. Now, again, these are potential timelines and have fluidity associated with them due to whatever may come up or what might not. In addition, last year, the prior body approved an amendment to include Langley McLean, which is not on this page. So that is where that one lies. And we already had for the Langley McLean, we did have the public meetings that we had for the scoping. We are, as staff, taking a look at where the preponderance of information, the feedback from the communities, and coming back with recommendations, and also to work with the magisterial district members, and I know some at-large members have expressed a concern of being involved in that process as well, to come back and really just then continue that conversation this spring is what it's set to be. In addition, I'll just go by region. In the top portion, Region 1 is Oakton. That's the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School new, and the objective to assign students to a new Fairfax Oakton Elementary School. The potential scoping, again, was fall 2020, spring 2021, potential boundary and anticipated effective date, school year 22-23. Well, realistically, as Mr. Frisch had pointed out, you know, we don't have a school site, and therefore, you know, that timeline is rather, it has to be more fluid and flexible. We did speak with the previous magisterial district member on looking at alternatives, and the current school board member about broadening that because of awareness she may have and of opportunities, because we couldn't find any other solution, even looking at repurposing existing office buildings. So we're continuing that conversation, and we'll be doing it, we'll be continuing that dialogue, of course, also in our 2x2s. Region number 5 is the second one, and that's Woodson Pyramid. It's Wakefield Forest Elementary School. This is one that, actually, this one, the next one and the next one, Oakview Elementary School, Old Creek Elementary School for Robinson Woodson, Region 4 and 5, and the next one, Region 5 Woodson and Little Run Elementary School, are all ones Ms. McLaughlin had concerns about and had dialogue with staff for quite some time about how are we going to address the capacity. One of the things we had in the conversation of the previous work session last year is we had some changes, and if folks go back and rewatch that, there was concern that Ms. McLaughlin raised during that meeting about enrollment changes, whether or not it was a one-year uptick in one of the smaller elementary schools or whether or not we were having other issues that we needed to go ahead and monitor. The agreement was, the consensus was to go ahead and monitor that enrollment, wait till we had this year's data, which are reflected in this CIP, and taking a look at the size of the actual site, keeping in mind the concerns the community and neighborhoods may have, and we have since done that. We will be having follow-up conversations with that magisterial district member about the next steps associated with that and how to continue moving forward now that we're at that point. And that really addresses Wakefield Forest, Oakview, Old Creek, and Little Run. The next item that was mentioned was Region 2. That's the Justice Pyramid. That's Glen Forest Elementary School. You heard Dr. Anderson mention 1,100 students and the capacity relief. We did have the scoping with the community meeting, and out of that meeting there was a lot of feedback that we received, and some of that is reflective of Dr. Anderson's concern of re-looking at the impacted area in a broader scope. The next one is, again, Region 2, Marshall High School, which is really Pyramid, and really Shrevewood Elementary School that you heard comments mentioned about Shrevewood Elementary School this evening as well, this afternoon as well, about capacity relief. And we were monitoring that, and I don't know if Ms. Gillis has any more to add to that, because I think we're going to be meeting to talk about what the next steps were. I mentioned the broadening of scope, the repurposing of Dunloring, and looking at how we were going to impact that. I will mention, thank you, Dr. Brabrand, for giving me that opportunity to recap that. I will mention that when, from a staff perspective, when we look at capacity and capacity issues, we look at on page 45, page 54, and of the new CIP, and page 60, which talks about the county-wide current and projected capacity utilization, and it mentions the elementary, the middle, and high schools respectively. And in looking at that, that is usually where we look at some of those extreme challenges in our hit parade, if you will, of capacity issues. Notwithstanding the issues that have been brought up here, and any that the board members may hear, the school board members who may hear in their magisterial district or at large across the community that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Jeff, just for the public, will you repeat the three page numbers?
I'm sorry, I do that a lot. The 3 pages are page 44 and 45, page 54 and 55 for the middle school, and then the high school is on the back of that, which is page 60. And what it shows is, in each table, it shows with and without modulars. It shows the capacity and the capacity utilization, and it shows it in the current school year and then in the 5-year continuum. So it gives you an indication of what may be going on. In addition to what Ms. Gillis had mentioned about the yellow and the reading of the CIP, where we have renovation, where we have construction going on, where we have plans, if you will, that are reflected in some of those individual ones with the highlight, those areas provide a good summation for people's reference.
All right, thank you so much. I think that was very helpful. Do I have any board members who have not yet spoken who would like to speak? Ms. McLaughlin?
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. I appreciate you noting last year's priority list in the CIP and with Wakefield Forest. We have not had our chance to review my Braddock District schools, so I look forward to that because I was studying this year's CIP, and as I expressed last year with the CIP, especially with the Woodson Pyramid Elementary Schools, there's just been broad fluctuation. And so I'd like to do a deeper dive basically and understand how can we having this kind of wide swing from one CIP to the next, and especially when we see what's going to happen now or what we're saying we're seeing, and then 5 years later it can be so dramatically different, even in our 5-year projections from 1 year to the next, because I would expect that there might be some fluctuation year to year, but year to year with a 5-year projection should be closer, and I'm still seeing wide fluctuations, which I think has got to make it difficult for the division to be able to plan for those situations. I know that the Wakefield Forest community is obviously going to be very eager to find out how they originally were projected to be 165% over capacity. Now it's at 132, and then with the renovation, it'll be down to about 94. And we'll get a chance to talk about how that's going to happen, because the biggest concern they had was we were going to have to do a boundary adjustment. So I think that's on my mind, along with I would share with Laura Jane Cohen, Fairview Elementary being projected at 119%. I think we're going to need to have some conversation together with staff, because what I've been hearing from Fairview right now even is that they're finding it difficult to have enough classroom space. And I'm also concerned that what I'm hearing from our principals sometimes about what we say, where we are with our program capacity. I'm going to give Fairfax Villa Elementary as an example. It's like 83%, dropping down to the mid-70s. Maybe it said 87%. They already are using and instructing students in very, very old trailers. And I will not even call them a learning cottage, as you know. And so I'm just seeing a bit of a disconnect between what's happening instructionally in some of our campus sites versus what's being listed in this document. And so I so deeply appreciate the great work that you and Jessica do. And so since I've got 19 seconds left, I'll just say that just at a macro level, I think having board members be able to meet with you guys is so critical, because 200 campuses is entirely complex. And the last thing I'll say is, since we're going to be doing budget, if you need any vocal support for getting more staffing into your office, because this is a massive enterprise, you've got my ear and voice for that, because
Thank you, Ms.
it's a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. McLaughlin. If I might just respond to that, the one thing that was mentioned is, you know, we look forward to definitely having that conversation because, Ms. McLaughlin, you're very aware of what's going on in the Braddock District schools and the meetings that we've had before as well. But I will say the data are reflected in the CIP come from self-reporting from principals initially. The forecast is ours. So we annually request that they do that. We do not include the trailers as meeting the capacity need. So in individual school instances where there are things going on and you're hearing things from your principals or what have you, definitely when we have our meetings, bring them up and let's take a look at it and see what's going on, because it may be that there's some program shift. It may be that there's something we missed, and we certainly need to have that conversation and look forward to it. And, you know, anyway, thank you very much for the support.
What about your staffing needs?
That's what I meant by support. Thank you.
Ms. Pekarsky?
Thank you. I love the visuals in this. I find it, you know, a picture can say 1,000 words sometimes. Something I brought up in our 2x2s, and I noticed on one of the first slides, you had the total number of out-of-boundary transfers for students and the programming breakdown. I personally would find it very helpful to have this breakdown for every school. And I'm wondering if there's a reason why we haven't done that in the past as part of the CIP.
Well, it has been, historically, it's been on our dashboard and the student profile reports, but certainly we can incorporate those into the CIP as well if that's a decision of the body and desire. But it is in those two areas that people can actually look for. We had broken down the categories in the past, and we do that as a part of the presentation, just to get an understanding that the large majority are in certain categories.
Well, the only reason I bring it up is because, I mean, personally, I think when we're looking at this, we're looking at individual schools, it would be helpful to see patterns as we're projecting these potential boundary shifts or looking for reasons why. So I just, wanted to throw that out there for consideration.
Thank you, Ms. McCarthy. We'll go ahead and make a note of that.
All right, thank you. Two things. I have go-backs for 5 people. If you, I'll call you individually and the one keyed up after. And if you aren't on the list, you can add yourself to the list in a second. I'm going to just comment briefly, but I do want to talk about process so people understand when what can happen next. So this being a newly constituted board for the majority, at this point, I think we're getting our ideas on the table. We have space at a work session on January 21st, which we can add an additional CIP work session. And I think that would behoove this board to do that. We can tentatively take a vote on that, hands up, hands down, to see if we want to add that. And then Ms. Corbett-Sanders and I will work to make that happen. The other thing is process. If it's something, as we discuss these things and people are saying this is a good idea, the idea is to make other people on the board, make your colleagues aware of why you have that advocacy, why you think that is a smart thing to do and why that would benefit. And so that's the building of consensus as we have phone calls and if we talk. Of course, we do much of it in public, but sometimes to get the details, you may have individual questions of people who are bringing that up. So and of course, amendments are only added the night of the vote of the CIP. So prior to February 6th, you would be having this conversation here today, on the telephone, with your colleagues, again on the 21st. And then the majority of us would all understand what the potential amendments would be. A board member can always add at the table anytime. But for this particular process, I think it's extremely important that we all understand what each other's advocacies are and prioritizing them, because the CIP is complicated with, as we all know. So with that said, I can address, why don't I address any questions to that right now? Go ahead, Carl.
You're saying
No, that should be discussed, but I'm saying if you want to make a formal amendment, that's when that happens. But discussion, you can bring it up now. If you have more information you want to share, you can bring it up to 6. And Karen, you want to say something?
And you build the consensus. So today is a great day to start talking about it. So you may say, I will be bringing an amendment to my colleagues on this subject. And then in the next few weeks, you will have conversations with your colleagues. We may have another work session on the CIP on the 21st, if everybody wants it. You can continue the discussion, but then the actual amendments are voted on February 6th. Am I correct? Is that the date? Yes. So we have some time, but that's the process. It doesn't mean you should wait until February 6th to say I'm having an amendment. You want to have those conversations starting now.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Just want to make sure if I understood what you had said earlier. The point of posting our amendments is also for the public to know what we're going to do. So you'd made a comment about the night before the vote, but technically we
No,
should be trying to
I
get.
just misspoke. No, I meant that right before the vote is what I meant to say. That's when, right before the vote is when we post amendments, but it's several days before.
Oh,
I
but-
meant,
yeah.
somebody said, should I make an amendment now? And that's what I meant to reference that. Like, this
Yeah.
is not something you make an amendment today.
No, I understand that,
Yeah.
but you said something about when we post them, and I just want to make sure everybody in the public understands. Ideally, what this board tries to do for transparency and for the public to be able to sign up, to speak, to advocate, is that we try to get our amendments in the Monday, no later than the Monday before that Thursday night vote. Sometimes it's great if you can even get them posted by close of business Friday, so that people have the weekend to talk with one another, and the community, again, has advance notice. But also legally understand process-wise, you could file something an hour before we go to the table. You can file something at the table. It's just all a matter of, it's certainly the more time, the better.
Thank you for that clarification. And Dr. Brabrand?
Obviously, it's the board's decision on all things process, but one thing, just thinking here, listening, and Jeff, tell me, Jessica, if we couldn't, based on what we hear today, and obviously, like you said, there's time up until really the final board meeting, we could bring a draft page, what is the new page? A new draft page 40, based on what we hear today, if there's another work session next week, for you to begin to react to or add to that draft, so that you and the public can see you engaged on that page, and then that page is ultimately what's in the final vote for the CIP. So that's just something to think about. I've already heard one board member say, hey, I want something on there. So we could bring a draft, not actionable, but just simply for the board to then collectively go, yes, we'd want it on there, no, take it off, or modify it. And that might help us get it even cleaner and tighter prior to that February 6th vote. Something to think about.
Another clarification question. If we go with Dr. Brabrand's idea of having a draft, what's being talked about today, if that's added to a draft page for us to consider, would that then negate the need for an additional amendment to be made because it will just be part of the document?
Right. Well, I think if it's part of the CIP and we agreed to it, I
Okay.
don't think it would have to have an amendment added to it. If we agreed to it prior to. I think Melanie was first in.
Yeah, I had a similar thought about, this net zero amendment, but more importantly, I'm thinking, how are adding of amendments going to change the staff's, timing? Like, how does it not change, but how does it impact your timing and ability to respond to all these things? Because I'd like to either give amendments, or if you want to take things from today and start working on them so that it fits your workflow schedule, I just don't want to be part of wreaking havoc on, asking for all sorts of things in an untimely manner.
I appreciate that. And the answer to that is it depends. It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about looking at the boundary scoping or capacity issues, that is the normal part of a CIP process. If you're talking about a division-wide shift, or saying that we look at the curriculum for instruction on sustainable initiatives and how we would incorporate the net zero design in with the curriculum, then I think that would be a little longer. We can certainly include it as a goal or objective or a focus area in the document. But the page 40 really becomes the two elements. The one, take a look at this, which the bottom portion would be, which I think that's where the renewable net zero would be, even though we want it yesterday. Take a look at the impact of this. How can we get to this? It provides an area of focus and acuity, strategically and targeted, for staff to be looking at what the broader impact is and moving in that direction. And then the upper portion of page 40 is, this is where we have to do something as immediately. And I know that, Mr. Frisch, you mentioned immediately. I'm on that, put the flag, pin in the map and all that. And I'm totally supportive of that. I would just say that I think that one would be, I think there's a little more involved in that, even though I've already tasked my staff with having that as part of a design, knowing what the impact of that is. I want to see the facts so I can share them with you, so we can all take a look at that. So I think it's twofold, and it depends, but the majority of things we'd be able to, I think, accomplish. We'd prioritize them in the future, too.
Dr. Brabrand?
I was going to just say, Jeff, if with staff for the net zero idea, if we had something at the next work session where we would have, maybe it's working offline with Carl to think about what would be a reasonable amendment if they wanted to plant a flag, but it's not going to be in the page 40. That's the boundary study. This is a separate issue about putting a goal within the CIP. Maybe that's something you could work offline, and then, but they could hear what that amendment potentially would be at the next work session if you wanted. They are two separate things.
They are. All right, this has generated, we need lots of clarity, so I have Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Ms. Keys-Gamarra, and then several others.
So Dr. Brabrand, to what you had said, that page 40 could end up being revised, and in our next CIP work session, you and staff might take some of the things we've said in today's work session, and it could inform what you now believe is going to be the recommendation to the board. So I guess, colleagues, what I would just share from my expectation from this about the page 40 and the priorities, all 12 of us can today talk about where we think that there might be maybe a revision to this. Dr. Braber, my expectation would be still that you and Mr. Plattenberg, along with his highly knowledgeable staff, would review the different inputs and proposals. Page 40 would change not because somebody just said it, but it's because you reviewed that against your existing recommendations in this CIP. And I only say that because I want to make sure both the public and the board understands we wouldn't necessarily have to have 7 amendments to page 40 if it turns out the things that people say today in their best judgment professionally think make sense. They make those revisions. And it, that way also, I say that because in years past, some board members were afraid that depending on your personal relationship with the superintendent, you might get your curried favor stuff done and others wouldn't necessarily. Certainly I know that Dr. Brabrand and Mr. Plattenberg's desire is to find the best operational practice. But I do think that is a way we could cut down on a lot of amendments, is you're looking at it with your expertise. Sure. And I certainly would support a revised page 40 in that vein.
Ms. Corbett Sanders?
And we're still talking about the process.
We're still talking about, these
Because
are
I have
all
some other
process
things.
questions.
The process would require, since this is a draft CIP that has to be adopted by the whole board, if with input from various board members, Dr. Brabrand and Mr. Plattenberg came back with a revised page 40, it would still require, since this was presented formally at a board table, it would require an omnibus amendment that says, somebody would say, amend the CIP as outlined with the proposal made by the superintendent, and that would be seconded and we would vote on it. I think what you're saying is to ease that conversation rather than having 7, 10, or 12 amendments, is to have that conversation earlier rather than later, have an agreement on that, and then make the change to the CIP.
I hear some conversation, and I think we have a parliamentarian, and we will clarify that point as to which is the best way to go with the omnibus motion, individual motions, or a predetermined agreement on page 40. All right? So Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Yes, I'm glad you clarified that, Ms. Derenak Kofax. I guess I was getting a little bit lost in the process myself. I thought I understood it initially, and then I wasn't sure, and then 46 was excluded, and part of this may be because I haven't had my 2-on-2 discussion, but I'm assuming that page 46 still exists until this board makes changes and has appropriate discussions. I think I'm not hearing, and I'd like clarification, that this has been discarded and we're starting from scratch. I don't think I'm hearing that.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So I am assuming that we will be having follow-up discussions to discuss the appropriateness of how to go forward for putting forth these priorities, and I look forward to that discussion.
Yes. And obviously, we will make room for that in January. And we will, try to continue some more of that discussion here. Ms. Cohen and Mr. Frisk. Could you wait then for, yes. Process only questions. Carl, is yours? No. Okay. Rachna.
Thank you. So just to clarify, so I understand, there's sort of two different, from my understanding from what I'm hearing, two different sort of conversations on either amendments or some form of draft to additions to the CIP. One is the revised page 46, which is really looking at potential boundary or capacity relief adjustments. And the other is, and again, I'm trying to summarize what I'm hearing, sort of broader policy when we're looking at renovation or capacity. So for example, the net zero initiative on new or, renovation, construction, however it flushes out, is a broader policy, goals, expectations, that would still be an amendment to the CIP.
Correct.
Just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
If I may, we do list the policies that are listed in the beginning of the CIP document, and you are correct that, in my understanding, would be a policy initiative. But because there's been multiple mentions of that desire by this body, I think incorporating it would be appropriate as well.
All right, thank you. So before I go to go-backs, that was my first part of my, now I have something specific to my region. And yes, and you can start my time. There is a bonded school in the Route 1 area. It is at the Pinewood Lakes property. It is something that was bonded almost simultaneously when the federal government provided funding for a Fort Belvoir Upper. And when that happened and the way things looked at the time, we knew we should wait a little bit because we also knew that Embark Richmond Highway was happening. And as if you look on my page 105, the capacity of the elementary schools has gone up significantly in Region 3. Karen and I share some of these, Karen Corbett Sanders and I share some of these schools, Havilah Valley, Riverside, Groveton. All of those schools need some capacity relief. And as we have a school currently bonded on the Pinewood Lakes site, it is, again, that site is, just for reference, it is on the Lee District side of the Route 1 highway, western side, yes. So it's my hope that this is something that should come and have conversation. It is time to talk about it. One of my hopes for that school in particular, this is a programming issue which is separate from this discussion, but I want to put it out there. There are no specific programming in that area arts-wise, like a Bailey's. There is nothing that you can really get to in any timely fashion from the Lee District or the Mount Vernon District to have that kind of programming in elementary school. So it's my hope that when we move forward about conversation, and I'll be happy to talk to any of you offline about that and the history and what I think I've heard from the community that they would like to see. And Ms. Corbett Sanders and I have talked about this extensively as well. All right. And Mr. Plattenberg, we've talked about this in our 2x2, so Mr. Plattenberg and his team are aware of it. So I have go-backs to begin, and Elaine, I have you first. Ms. Tolan.
All right, several things. One, I wanted to go back to, I've been scouring over the page 45, I forget the middle school page 60, with the numbers that you have for utilization outlined specifically. And so I've got a number of schools at the top of these lists on elementary, Kent Gardens, Hutchison, et cetera. But primarily looking at the high schools, I was wondering a couple of things. So on page 60, where we have the top 5 high schools with capacity, high capacity issues, we have 3 of those high schools, Centerville, Oakton, and Falls Church, have upcoming renovations. 2 of the high schools, McLean and Chantilly, do not have any renovation or any capacity enhancement planned for them. McLean is on the, I'm going to keep that on that page 40 for, potential boundary change with Langley High School. So there's some activity around McLean High School. However, as we've had the discussions, we need to be very, very careful about the number of students we're moving out of McLean into Langley to avoid any overcrowding at Langley and rippling boundary changes. I know page 40 is for boundary changes, priority boundary changes. And I do know if we pick through the CIP, if we look back, if we want to talk about McLean specifically, if you go to page 99, where all of the Region 1 schools are listed and what's happening around them, there is a mention that there is we're looking at a potential addition or capacity enhancement for McLean with the addition of, the F listed there. But could we add, page 41 as priority future capacity enhancements or priority, things we want to monitor very, very closely? Not, McLean would be for potential capacity enhancement. Chantilly might be for, really looking at future boundary changes or capacity around that whole Region 4 area where you've got so many overcrowded high schools. I just think we have these high priority items.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out when you were asking, like, how do we have another prioritization of the priorities or of the ones that we identify? And I was trying to think about in the conversations that we have, I think that is the great opportunity to go ahead and flesh those out a little further. I was trying to think about how that would be, in addition to those pages I mentioned that show the capacity issues, where you could provide more narrative about more concerns other than the ones that then make it on the list of page 40 that are down in the bottom portion. That bottom portion usually is something's cooking here and we need to be looking at it. I don't know, let us reflect on that to see if there's some other opportunities on how to address it, because I'm not really sure quite off the top of my head. But we'll go ahead and reflect on that and get back to you.
Great. All right, thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you. Actually, I had a couple of other things to speak about, but I do want to suggest, in reference to what we just talked about or what you were just talking about, I think that is all part of the broader boundary policy discussion, which is forthcoming. So I would urge that we hold off on that until we have that broader discussion. Regarding some of the other things, I think it's time for us to start looking at building a new queue, a new renovation queue, because we are almost done with it. And it's really important for us to start talking about that now, perhaps the criteria for the renovation queue, and begin to building it. The other thing is I wanted to follow up on the discussion about our alternative schools and how they are decreasing in numbers. And I would really like us to start thinking about, from a programming point of view, whether or not it's time to really look at a 2E school. And so I would like to put that in as a next step on when we're looking at increased capacity availability at our alternative schools, if it's time to look at programming in a 2E area. Last, I do want to talk a little bit about our process for capacity demands and the challenges that we face, because, and this somewhat addresses some of the comments Ms. McLaughlin mentioned, we don't look at capacity demands until the shovel has been turned on an individual project. We know that with the increased growth in Fairfax County, that the Board of Supervisors is authorizing a number of multifamily developments throughout the county. And I think that close collaboration between the county and the Board of Supervisors and the school board, we really need to address this issue or tee it up at the forthcoming retreat between the two boards in early February. But we also need to bring attention to the work of the Schools Committee of the Planning Commission, which has been underway for the past couple of years or several years. And And I know that there have been a number of modifications to the comprehensive plan because of the excellent work of that committee. And I just urge that all of my colleagues take a look at that, and if you need it to be sent around to you, we can make sure that that happens. And so, once again, reiterating my next steps, time for a new queue, reimagining some of our alternative school capacities for possibly a 2E, and then looking at and having a conversation with the Board of Supervisors on how we can more closely collaborate on development initiatives that impact our schools.
Dr. Bray.
Just one thing, I totally support the point of the new queue. In fact, on page 36, I know, Mr. Plattenberg, you've referenced we need to begin looking at addressing that. You said by 2023. I recognize board members are saying, hey, can we get to doing that work now? And one of the nuggets I think that's also in this CIP that you made a point is we've taken that long, long list over the last several years and we've narrowed it down to how many were left on here? How many were left on here? I don't even know on page. I can't add it up right up. 2, 4, 6, 18. All of them are currently funded either for planning purposes or for construction. So it may be the time with this new board reconstituted to see if we can certainly start to do the work and present it as soon as we can, what that new queue looks like so that this new board can react to it. And I can work with you and Jessica and figure out the parameters of what seems like a reasonable timeline.
Yeah, I think it would
Dr.
be,
Brabrand.
I think it would be perfectly aligned with the idea about reinstituting the infrastructure committee. It was the infrastructure finance committee back in whatever, 2012, 13 or so. So I think that would align.
Were they part of, and I know that was the 5 years I went away, took a nap and left Fairfax. Was that part of developing that original queue?
No.
No.
If you, in the CIP, it references the history of the queue, when it was done, the 3 years that it was looked at. It mentions the criteria that the school board at that time had approved. Initially, it was done based upon just the facility construction, whether or not it was a physical plant and deterioration. The second time it was viewed, the board determined that they wanted to have a criteria about meeting educational requirements, et cetera. And when you take a look at those components that are listed in this document, you'll be able to determine whether or not you want to consider that same thing. One of the conversations that was had, and I know in the 2x2s that we have had, the number of points that were made about working with the county, the concept and what has been heard and talked about identifying a criteria of looking at all countywide facilities. So I think the timing of this, as Dr. Brabrand suggests, is perfect to begin earlier rather than later. We mentioned that from a standpoint of the physical plant, construction, renovation cycle as to when would the appropriate time to begin looking at doing it again moving forward. But certainly if we look at all Fairfax County facilities and we do some kind of rating, even though we accommodate the nuances, whether it's a recreation center or a school or an office building, we can go ahead and begin that conversation as a part of those committee suggestions.
This would actually begin as part of our joint retreat between the two boards, is to tee it up.
All right, I think that's an excellent idea, that will be part of the, of our retreat when we talk about it, because, well, I don't want to take anybody else's time, but I think that's good. Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
Thank you very much. In terms of some of the policies, I wanted to clarify my question earlier in terms of boundary versus policy. I do think as we are aiming to be an excellent school system and a leader in the country, I would like to look at how we define capacity and how we define core programs. I went and looked a little more at core spaces are mandatory learning spaces, page 231. Capacity is number of students supported by restriction of program of studies. I would love to look at policy as looking at capacity as program of studies, not just core curriculum and self-contained special education classes, but music, arts, project-based learning spaces such as the environmental education spaces we talked about, and opportunities for more inclusive on team taught honors special education classes, not just self-contained special education classes. So I'd like to look at our policies a little more broadly and how we define capacity. And I'd love to see some of the capacity numbers with some of that thought around it, is what do we have in the building now, as opposed to, so what are our mandatory spaces and where do you want to build to? That's something I'd love to see, especially in terms of what we have now in terms of music and arts. The other thing I'd like to see is we talk about, and I love the data on split feeder schools, but in terms of addressing split feeder schools as part of the sort of the queue for boundary changes or for capacity enhancements, or part of the policy around boundary changes or capacity enhancements. I know I hear from the community a lot across the county regarding concerns around split feeder schools and attendance islands. I know I've been hearing from families at Rolling Valley about some of the attendance islands there as well, but I'd like to see split feeder schools as one of the priorities or factors in looking at capacity or boundaries. So two different pieces is expanding our sort of definition of core programming for schools to look at our space in the way we want it to be used and in the way that it is actually being fully used, as well as split feeder schools as factors in boundary adjustments or capacity enhancements.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser. We do have, I think will be a good opportunity to have you come in and meet with our staff so I can actually articulate further, because obviously I'm not doing a very good job. We do have a lot of flexible spaces that we do identify, and there are some of those needs that you mentioned that are accommodated through that are in our educational specification. There are opportunities for what you're speaking of as well that we definitely could codify as a part of it. And in terms of the split feeders, we have a page in the CIP that actually lists the split feeders, but we could definitely.
167, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some opportunities around both of those areas. And it is, by the way, I forgot to mention, it is part of the board priorities, by the way. When you look at the things to take into consideration, that is one. But, you know, how that's priority, again, if this body wants to, right, the policy.
And I think it's interesting to see, as you see so many things, there's boundary, there's everything that rules programming. It all kind of rolls in. And, you know, as we have meeting upon meeting, we will begin to solve some of these issues. But thank you all for the excellent conversation. I have Dr. Anderson, followed by Ms. Cohen.
Actually, I will yield my time because my question was regarding split feeder schools on page 167, because again, the impact to families and communities is significant. I would like to raise this as a priority.
Thank you. Ms. Cohen, followed by Mr. Frisch.
I just, you know, of course, didn't want to miss an opportunity to talk about Clifton Elementary School from this seat. Just a few things. I think when you look, we have some troubling areas in our regions, in the Springfield District proper. And one of the things looking at is, you know, Orange Hunt, which we've already had a conversation about. I know we will continue to have conversations about, but when you look at an elementary school that's projected to be at 122% capacity, is not in the queue, and then, not surprisingly, feeds a middle school that is increasingly over utilized, and then feeding now a brand new, beautiful, renovated West Springfield High School that is also over capacity. So we have a really large monster that is spreading, you know, more and more kids, and we're getting a building again now that's creeping up to a number of kids that they are not able to access the same educational opportunities that kids in smaller programs with schools right next, touching them, Cherry Run and White Oaks, which I know feed Lake Braddock, that are significantly underutilized and have some space. And so I look forward to conversations about that, but that's a big one for me. You know, not to beat a dead horse, but it is always interesting to remember that when we look at the space where Clifton Elementary School used to be, we see in the 2024 or 25 projections, that we look at Fairview, that is now going to be 119. We look at Union Mill, which is 91, but feels with, 1,000 kids, like a very different percentage than that, to be frank. And then Oakview creeping up again. So I would like to know, and I hope that my colleagues will support me in adding an amendment to look at a Clifton boundary study, a feasibility study. How many kids are we actually talking about? And are there programmatic opportunities? I look at where we have projections that we're going to turn our admin sites into other potential go back to elementary schools, which is great, like Dunn-Loring, but then where do we house our admin facilities? So I think I will just say that community is ripe for some response, that just continuing to maintain and mow the lawn is not the answer for Clifton Elementary School. So I'd like us to come up with some definitive conversations about what the possibilities are. And if there aren't any more possibilities, then what happens to that site? Because we've left a vacant building. So that is near and dear to my heart. I partner with Stella in Centerville, even though we're on the list, figuring out a remedy to get us to the renovation. That's it. Sorry. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Mr. Frisch, followed by Ms. McLaughlin, and then Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
I'll be brief. I wanted to elevate something that Chairman Corbett Sanders mentioned about these projects that have not yet, begun, not being part of the equation that comes into what our facilities should expect in the years ahead. I look at Providence District, and in Tysons, Merrifield, Falls Church, we're talking about potentially hundreds, in some cases more than 1,000 more kids in the years ahead that are not part of the equation currently. And I hope that we address this. It sounds like there's significant support from the board to look at the way that we're doing this so that we're not caught unaware. You talk to folks in McLean and in the Tysons area, and without fail, they all say, and now it doesn't necessarily make it so, but when you look at these other numbers, they all say, look, we're not being counted properly. And the trajectory of the schools in that area would point in that direction. I too would like to say that I would love to have the support of my fellow board members for prioritizing, in terms of boundaries, Shrevewood Elementary School, which is significantly over capacity today and only getting worse according to these estimations in the years ahead. It's something that parents in the community have been asking for, and it would be nice to be able to do what we've already committed to them. And I also have significant concerns about a pair of other elementary schools. I think 3 of the 5 on the list for the highest utilization are from Providence District. Pine Spring and Woodburn, I think we'd be looking at feasibility there as well. So that's it.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin.
I just want to comment on a few things that my colleagues have shared. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, I do like the idea of us looking at our definitions on capacity use, what is core programming. So thank you for bringing that up. Ms. Cohen, I have been an 8-year voice of support for Clifton Elementary property, so I want to thank you for bringing it up. It is long overdue. I will gladly put both hands up in the air. Dr. Brabrand, I don't want to see another year go by that we do not do an enrollment and capacity evaluation for the schools that surround Clifton Elementary and the students that are currently being bused to other overcrowded elementary schools. The other thing is that I just want to kind of speak to, because I did not see this change happen, and I really would like, Mr. Plattenberg, if you could speak to this, why the staff decision to leave the page 40 blank with the idea that the school board would populate it. Again, as we've been reminded in my 8 years on the board, we are not the operational experts. Our job is to help with the governance component. And so it's worrisome to me that when you have a school board that is not operational facilities experts, that we would populate a priorities list, and that we had one this past year that I do support and believe you brought your best thinking to it. I, as one board member, want you to continue bringing your best thinking to that page. So I do think that page 46 of last year, where it was populated, should be the starting point. You did a great job walking through how some things have changed. So I'm not necessarily saying that that repopulates it at that, but I want that as a model. And I would even welcome, so far as Dr. Brayburn, to have the board members raise their hand to give you some direction, but I do not support at all leaving that blank and having been populated by the board. I don't think that serves the system.
So I do want to clarify a remark Ms. Keys-Gamarra made that I think is clear. And listen, sometimes there's so many things going on. I didn't have a chance to huddle with Mr. Plattenberg about whether to have it a blank page to give the sense of a new board, getting a chance to hear. Page 46 remains operational. That's what the board voted on, and that's what remains in effect. We're going to have a new CIP. We have a work session now, and we brought you that work session with that page blank. If I had to do it over again, I would have brought it probably populated within what our recommended changes would have been. What I'm just going to do now is frankly having listened to all of you, what was on there, you know, that people want on, we're going to bring back. If there was something, and I know maybe some conversations you've had about some things that with new information you don't want on, and we'll just present that revised page at the next work session on Monday. So that's on me. I didn't have that conversation, but no. What's on page 46 remains in effect and operating until the board changes otherwise. And we'll be making that in February 6th to the CIP.
So in other words, Mr. Plattenberg, I'm just trying to compliment you that your expertise matters.
Thank you. Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you. I kind of got cut off with my time mid-sentence, so I want to go back and clarify, and I wanted to be respectful of our process of what the reason for my comments. I wanted to make sure that we listed as a next step with respect to how we're dealing with multifamily units, and perhaps that may be a necessary discussion as a board, but I do think that we need to look at how we're dealing with that. I don't think in the future that we can continue to assume that we won't have children in those units. With respect to our boundary discussion, I do think that's another kind of ground zero discussion. Having participated in the very necessary meetings for McLean and Langley, it is very clear to me that the community does not understand and feels rather confused by our process. And so we may need to take some steps to make sure that our communication is clear, what our definitions mean, what we're doing, what that process is, and how they participate. And so I just wanted to make sure that we are looking at that as a communications opportunity, so that perhaps we can avoid future, local government clashes as we've gone through in the past. One of the things, and I think I have the page marked, I think it was page 28. So that was my next step, by the way. I want to make sure that that's clear. With respect to how we're looking at boundaries, I think a little A below that would be, can we have a discussion with respect to how our programming is impacting segregation of our county? And are we involved in resegregation? And if so, are we in a position to do something about that? And as we have had our forum topic on bias and that sort of thing, I think that this goes hand in hand with that. So that would be my next step. And I also think that community discussion will need to be something that we then can more carefully carry. And I think this has been mentioned before. I think I mentioned it with the previous board, so I want to make sure I mention it here, and that is having those discussions with the Board of Supervisors so that we can then present our story, because we don't work in silos. We've got the CIP, but we also, a companion to that is our budget. We have to present evidence to get what we need. And so the more we can clarify that, I think the better off we all are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone who hasn't had a second go back that they want before I go to thirds? Alrighty, we have two people who want to speak, and Ms. Tolan and Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. One of the items I had was about the best practices for educational specifications. I'm thinking around STEM labs, computer labs, outdoor learning in particular. Dr. Presidio, I know that we have the science team a couple of years ago completely designed ed specs for outdoor learning. So those exist, and we can add that to the discussion. Also, around sustainability goals, we talked about net zero, which I fully support. Another idea that I've talked with some of my colleagues about is because with renovations, net zero can be difficult, but we do use the CHIPS program, Collaborative for High Performing Schools, when we do our construction and renovation. However, we've never done a third-party verification of that work. And I think that that might be something we could look at as a sustainability goal. You know, what are we really doing? Those CHIPS criteria span across the facilities, student health, student curriculum involved with sustainability, et cetera. And I think we've got 2 middle schools, for example, in planning right now, Frost and Cooper. They might be great candidates for, you know, actually doing this third-party verification process. So I wanted to throw that out there. And lastly, just want to finish up with, you know, hopefully, again, you know, gaining support from my colleagues on, you know, Karen, I appreciate your comments around communication, around, you know, what we're doing right now with McLean and Langley. You know, we really need to kind of, you know, make sure the community feels supported and that they understand what the process is and the timing and how we're working on that moving forward. I'd also like to get hopefully support on this idea of putting in the CIP something beyond just what are our priority boundary changes, but what are some, you know, schools that we really, really need to be watching, like McLean High School. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson.
Just going back a little bit to Glen Forest and a sidebar with Ms. McLaughlin, she wanted to be sure that I expressed her support in Glen Forest being high on the priority list because of the issues that we've mentioned prior to this, earlier in this conversation. My question goes back a little bit in terms of looking at what we are doing with schools and how we're planning schools. It's difficult as I'm just looking at even Mason District, and if you were to make boundary adjustments, there are a lot of constraining and competing priorities. And one of those things that I also noticed is, you know, the sizes of the schools. I bring this up in terms of, for elementary and middle school, should we be having the conversation of an optimal size school? How do we right-size school? I was a principal of a school of 170 students. I was a principal of a school of 1,000 students. These are very different experiences. And when you're having conversations to adjust boundaries, the limitations of certain school sizes really limit the impact that you can have in terms of how you cast your net. So I am wondering, as we're looking at additions, as we're looking at expansions, as we're looking at new schools, how do we catch that conversation to kind of guide us as a framework? When it comes to middle school and elementary schools. It seems as if, at least I may be wrong on this, but it seems as if in high schools, the number that I've been hearing quite a bit is 2,500, maybe a little bit more. So we probably are a little bit closer with high schools in that conversation than we are with elementary and middle, but I would like to throw that out there as a conversation for us to have. I also wanted to make sure that I outline very clearly my next steps in terms of my advocacy. Glen Forest definitely, split feeder schools. What conversations have we had about addressing that issue, and what conversations can we begin to have regarding that issue? And of course, the reduction of trailers, because we see everybody has that. I won't even list the number of schools that have high numbers of trailers, but I think that's a consistent issue, but I'd like to have some conversation regarding that as well.
Mr. Plattenberg, can you just address Dr. Anderson's? We did have a thorough analysis of size of schools, but it can be with this board. We can talk about that again, but if you can enlighten this board when that was last done.
Just real briefly, two things. The first thing I'll say is, Ms. Tollins, that I've already assigned my staff to go ahead and have third-party verification. And in the 2x2s, that's been the beauty of the 2x2s. It's helped inform the direction and vision of members just to make sure that we are inspecting what we expect. But to Dr. Anderson's point, yeah, School Board Policy 8120.2 has a new revision that's in that includes the actual size, preferred size of elementary, middle, and high school. We did have work sessions that Ms. Derenak refers to where that was discussed deeply, and I will just say that the elementary school is not 1,000. So when you look at what the school board policy is, there are some opportunities around that to where things have gotten to where they are at other schools. But yeah, the board did do a lot of work around that. Certainly we can go back through it and delve in further. I know that Ms. Muhlenberg probably has the actual work sessions that we looked through that, and we can provide in that conversation that was held.
The board before the last one.
Correct. 2013, sorry.
2013, that's what I had asked, yes. Thank you. Keys Kamara.
I just have to come back because, as I recall, and we've had a number of discussions mentioning Glen Forest, but then I looked at the page for it and I don't see it, but I do know, or at least I believe, and if I'm recalling correctly, the previous board had a lot of conversation about Glen Forest. Our board member Sandy Evans asked us to make some considerations. So is there, Dr. Plattenberg, can we just get are you prepared to give us, I'm sorry, I did not mention this to you ahead of time, so I'm talking so you can gather your thoughts. But I just feel like I need to know, and I think Dr. Anderson needs to know, the board needs to know, where are we on that? Because I know that we had some discussions, some meetings going on. So if we could just kind of get a status on where we are on Glen Forest, I think that would be helpful.
Well, again, the status of that is that we did have the scoping meetings. We did go out with the community, and the feedback from the community was in conflict with the original parameters that were provided. That was the majority of the information that I got from OCCR. It was during the timing that there was the transition between the previous elected officials and this board. And so in our conversations in the 2x2s, we were informed that the community has been outspoken about taking a look at, if we're going to look at one individual school, that whole pyramid has a number of schools with issues that we need to take a look at the same time. And I think that's what Dr. Anderson informed us back. So we're really taking a look at the data in concert with that feedback, and we'll be coming forward with a recommendation, hopefully as a part of this CIP.
So let me, you can finish.
Mr. Plattenberg, this may help. Karen, we did a scoping, but it was a small number of schools. I think some of the community feedback is expand that circle of schools, because as you start trying to solve one problem, you're creating another problem. So the original scoping to look at the Glen Forest issue was a smaller subset of schools. I think some of the community feedback, Mr. Plattenberg, correct me if I'm wrong, is broaden that out a little bit more before making a final set of decisions. Is that accurate?
And
So we can bring you a little bit more from that by next Monday.
Yeah, I think I need, because I'd like to know what section of the community, are we talking about Glen Forest parents that made this determination? Are we talking about a broader swatch?
Okay.
Because I know there was a great deal of work done in that area, so I need to understand where
Got it.
we are. And
Got
then
it.
I think we might have a better idea of where we need to go.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. We have done an excellent job of staying on time today. We have, I understand, some next steps. We can see those. What number are we starting on? 216 to 225, is that where we? All right, so what these are, we have, you all have mentioned something, and these are where it will require additional work of staff to get the information to us. So I will read them out loud. The person who may have brought forward to this, if you want to speak to that. And then we usually just do a heads up, nodding, hands up, quick, to see if we're all supportive of this. Because remember, everything that we put forward to staff takes time, and we want to make sure these are priorities we all agree on. So the first one, consider reinstating joint cap. Karen, you want to say something first?
Yeah, 216 and 223 should be brought together as one, because one is tee it up at the retreat, and then as part of the teeing it up, hopefully have that happen.
All right, so 216, consider reinstating the joint capital committee task force with the county and discussion of development and its impact during the joint school board of supervisors retreat, with the intent of having the board-to-board broader discussion. Can I see a show of hands on that for support? No, but oftentimes they do. They're provide clarification in the CIP about capacity specifically for special education students. Any questions or agreement? Do you want a change in the wording? Yes, you can speak to it.
Really, this is about having, is there capacity specifically for programs? What's listed in the CIP talks about self-contained special education classes, but there's really some need for team-taught honors classes and a more broad range of special programming for special education students that isn't just self-contained. And as well as the 2E that you talked about, 2E school. Yeah.
I think this might be, I fully support this, but I'm not sure it's a CIP topic as much as something that should come into our discussion about greater inclusion and equity in our instructional programming. And so,
I think it may have come up specifically around capacity in some of the alternative sites like Quander and Burke School, to see if there's, my original comment had been around capacity. The Quander and Burke schools weren't broken down in terms of capacity as the other schools were in the CIP. There was one number that listed the number of students at all of those schools, but it wasn't broken down in terms of how filled are they in terms of building capacity. And that's where that had come from in terms of, do we have room in, I've heard from some of the community wanted to have honors and additional, more advanced programming available within those sites for the students who are there. So that's where the genesis of that question came, which is much more specific.
Right.
It still may not be a CIP question.
Right.
but-
Well, I think it can be, because you have an aggregate and you want it broken down by site. Jessica, you understand what.
so it might be something like disaggregate the data provided on the alternative schools to identify capacity/programming for each of those schools. Right.
Mr. Plattenberg had mentioned that potentially the per student sort of capacity might be greater in those schools because the needs of the students may be greater. So it'd be interesting to see what that sort of square footage per student number is. So that's.
And Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, you can actually look at that on the dashboard, but I think this is a good thing to have it actually disaggregated and put into the CIP. The one thing that won't be shown here is some of the unique programming at each of those schools. For example, at Quander, there are a number of AP and honors courses already being provided. I don't believe that Mr. Plattenberg has the list of those.
Okay, so.
And so, let's start from a CIP point of view.
Capacity CIP.
If we could just, that, I think you've got it, disaggregate the data.
The data on enrollment as well as building capacity.
For our alternative special education programs.
Okay. Melanie, you still have a question on this?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
Well, it seems like 217, 221, and 223 are all talking about capacity and defining of programs. So can we create a larger bucket here of what that is? And then my second thing is just a point of order. I just would really please if we could just keep to the agenda because 7 of us have to leave town and drive down to Richmond. So just want to be sure that we're not headed out later than necessary. Thank you.
Well, we have to have discussion on this, and so you want now to, so who is the what numbers did you say?
217, 221, and 223.
With
All
all due
about
respect, Ms.
capacity.
Marin, I would prefer keeping 221 with the concept of having a 2E alternative school. Capacity for a 2E alternative as a standalone. I think that's slightly different than what Ms. Sizemore-Heiser has requested, and so I would prefer.
And you were the maker of that. Okay. All right. So let's go back right now. So Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, are you fine with number 217? Yes. Yes. Can I see a show of hands, people that can support this? All right, that's the majority. Number 218, provide the cost per mile for bus transportation for students. Can I see support for Mr. Plattenberg? That's doable, right? Support? Hands up. All right. 219, provide options to build sustainability into the CIP within the ed specs. Whose was that? Mine. Are you agree with the language? Okay. Everybody? Hands up. 220, provide transfer breakdown data by school. Whose was that? And you're comfortable with the language? Okay. All right. I see consensus on that.
Jessica, did you have a question on that one?
Are you asking for it to be provided in this year's CIP? Or do you want to just identify where that information is, if someone was interested in getting that information, like provide the link to the dashboard? Or are you asking that this be incorporated in this version of CIP?
Consolidate, yeah.
How much work would it take to put in the CIP versus just a link to the information?
A lot.
Could we just go for this year with the link to the information and then work on incorporating it in the next year's CIP if we have a link that is put in the CIP that could link the information?
Since we are here, where we are in the process, yes. Thanks.
You'll still be able to get the data that you need. That's the key. It's just, right. 221, with increased capacity becoming available in our alternative schools, consider developing a 2E alternative school. Ms. Corbett, are you comfortable with that? Yes?
I just want to speak to that. I support the concept of a 2E alternative school, but I also want to put a caveat in that it needs to be with the mindset that we need to look at least restricted environment inclusive practices first and better support our 2E students within their schools to make sure this is an alternative. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we sort of had that mindset there.
Show of hands, please, on that. Who would support that? All right. Begin a new queue. I think we all agreed to that. I don't think they're correct. Do we all agree to building a new queue? All right. 223, look at how we define capacity and how we define core programs. I'm sorry, say who's? Discussion for the board. Right, that's more our discussion. So yeah, it's not really a next step. All right, so we're going to take that one off.
I would recommend keeping it on because it is the way for the board to track its own requests for additional work. If it disappears off this list, I don't know who's then keeping a log and a track, and that is an important future goal for the board.
I don't have an objection to that.
Can we clarify that that the board
Yes,
will
just
look
that.
at how we define?
Yes.
so that it's clear that it's the board doing this work?
Ms. Sizemore?
Sorry, the only thing I would consider adding is get a clear definition in our CIP and how it's currently defined, and then the board can look at whether you want to change it, because I found it a little, perhaps different than our understanding. It may not be that we need to have them do the work to clarify, it may just mean that we want to look at it. But that's just something I want to throw out there, is we want them to have it clarified first before we look at it.
Have staff clarified and then board look at?
Yeah.
Okay. Because, right, exactly. You need to know what you need to know.
Yeah, we need what we're starting
Right,
with, and the
right.
more, I would like more clarity on what we're starting with.
Okay, so now that is the next step for staff as well as us. All right, thank you. 224, look at how multifamily units are addressed in the CIP.
And
Specifically, what,
that has to do with Mr. Plattenberg in educating us with respect to how we're counting students being generated from multifamily units. And then the board just needs to be informed regarding that, and we can figure out what needs to happen next.
okay. Do I see consensus on that? Hands up. Consensus? All right, thank you. And the last one, take advantage of communications opportunities to educate and engage the public in the CIP process.
You want me to?
Who talked about
That
that?
is mine.
That is yours, okay. Does that say what you need to say?
Mostly. I don't know that we need to revise it. I think Mr. Plattenberg understands what I'm saying, and that is that we need to talk about how the process is occurring with the community, and it also needs to involve staff with respect to how we improve that process. Is that?
Jeff, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I'll engage with OCCR about that.
Okay, that sounds good. Ms. Omesh would like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps instead of saying take advantage of the opportunity, can we delineate the plan or outline the steps? Yeah.
Outline steps, what do you want to say?
Let's say, outline steps. Right. For communication and outreach.
To educate, yes.
Right, to educate the community on the CIP.
Perfect. All right. Oh, boy, two more. Okay, I saw you first.
I had three. One had to do with resegregation.
Okay, if you would like to.
Right. Mr. Plattenberg, we were discussing how we could do this, so why don't you just go ahead and tell them how we can do it?
Well, the statement that Ms. Keys-Gamarra had mentioned in the session was, different programs, she wanted to have further a look at how different programs may or may not have caused or influenced any form of desegregation. Dr. Brabrand.
Analyze program impact on resegregation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Helen?
So a couple of things that I think are not up there, that we get at a little bit. Several of us brought up the idea of program capacity and educational specifications and best practices in education. That's not necessarily a this year's CIP question, it's more of an ongoing discussion moving forward. But I
So
think
how would
that
you like to
needs-
phrase that?
Analyze current best practices in education and the currency of our educational specifications and how that affects capacity.
No, that's
that make sense?
not, look at that, Elaine, that's not right.
Is this the one that refers?
It's very overarching. We talked about STEM labs, we talked about special
right,
education,
right.
we talked about outdoor learning spaces.
I think, Ms. Tolan, analyze best practices in education and assess impact on FCPS ed specs and CIP plan.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is that specific enough? Because this is such a analyze practices in education. That is huge.
It
I
is
wouldn't even know
huge.
where to begin.
Well, we
if I were
won't have
staff.
that for next week, but I think
that's a big
what you're saying is, what are all the additional developments in education, and are we planning ahead
That's a dissertation.
we're,
I think what's important, and you guys want to stay on time, what's important in the next steps is that we understand and staff understands what we're asking for. We don't have the time or opportunity to sometimes wordsmith, but I think if you're getting concurrence from the superintendent and Mr. Plattenberg and Ms. Ellis, that they understand what you would like, then I think we're in a okay place. So Dr. Brabrand and you understand, and Mr. Plattenberg. Is that?
Ms. Derenak Kofax, I had suggested earlier that on the 21st, when they come back to us, that staff actually provide a brief overview of the EdSpec process that might be able to inform that discussion into what we need to do going further. And so if we actually do that, we include EdSpec into that discussion, that might help us to figure out where we want to take 227.
Go ahead.
I just actually wanted to look back at 226 and say, can we, think about not just resegregation, but on equitable access in terms of geography to programming? Because one of the things that I had mentioned in my 2x2s is looking at programming from a geographical perspective is if you're at a certain school, how far do you have to travel to get access to some enrichment programs? That would.
Yeah, certainly with any of the analyzed, we'll be working with actually deferring to the Instructional Services Department, also Student Services, and trying to work with them on any analysis of their programs and where they're located.
Dr. Anderson, do you want to add something specifically to number 227? Because I see that your comfort level.
I'm sorry, this could not go anywhere, but I want to go on record as saying I'm concerned about the turnaround of some of these issues for staff. I'm not questioning their expertise and their bandwidth, but some of these are really big questions. Are we looking for this next week, next month, or in the next 2 years? So I just want to make sure we're being very thoughtful in terms of when we want this information back, and how to best parcel it out so that it is something that they can do within that time frame.
And yes, and I do understand that. And what happens in some of these next steps, Dr. Brabrand sometimes puts them in his Brabrand briefing, the ones that are easy, he'll give you references and he'll give you links. To some of these that are bigger and more overarching, we take those issues to chairs, we discuss it, and then we come back to the full board and say, this is not going to take us 2 weeks. This might take us 3 months to get, or it may take us a further analysis, or we might need outside help for this. These are all, this isn't not this specific issue, but that's what happens sometimes in the next steps. And so you will get feedback on where we are and where we're going, and when you can get the answers to these specific numbered questions. No, it's not, and that's all part of the process. There's some, I never want to make an assumption that you all understand or what, watched enough, because when you're in it, it's just different, right? And there's bigger issues that take time, and there's ones that they can provide a link for within, a day or so to get us, so. Last one.
Okay, last one. The other one that we talked a little bit about, and I think Mr. Plattenberg and Jessica, you talked about maybe looking into, we have our boundary list, page 40. Can we have a key item list that's not boundaries, that we're looking at some of these schools with big capacity issues?
you mean like schools to watch?
We'll try to figure out how to
Or
address
what are
that.
we thinking about for some of these schools?
Just
you
as
know?
we said with some of these issues, as Dr. Anderson pointed out, that may seem consumptive, we'll try to figure out a response, and if that doesn't accommodate, we can then add on and have conversations.
Right. Thank you all. This work session is complete. In order for our clerks to transfer the tape so this can be then sent to the public, we have a 5-minute break, and then we